Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in a few minutes here. In the meantime, if you can hear me, just please chat yes in the chat box. If you can't find the chat box, if you go to the bottom of the screen and hover, there should be an option to chat. And while we're waiting, if you could please introduce yourselves in the chat box with your name, title, and organization, that'd be great. Okay, I think we've given folks enough time to show up, and I'm sure some other people will be trickling in here shortly. In the meantime, I did want to do a quick introduction. My name is Brad Segara, and I'm the Senior Resilience Researcher for Mercy Corps. And I'll be moderating the webinar today. And I'm going to try and do a quick intro here so we can get right into the main event. But first, I'd like to thank the Resilience Measurement, Evidence, and Learning community of practice for bringing us here together today. I encourage everyone to check out their website. It's measuringresilience.org. You can see it there on the introduction slide. And if you are interested in becoming a member, you can send an email to info@measuringresilience.org. This is one of a series of webinars that they've been putting on. The next one is going to be on one of the COP Innovation Awards, and this is looking at resilience measurement for adaptive management. The exact date is yet to be determined, but if you become a member, you should get an email update on that. Also, there's a few other websites I have here on the slide. We have the mercycorps.org/research/resilience. This is like the master site on Mercy Corps that connects you to all of our resilience guidance, documents, research, and we refer to some of those documents in this presentation. So this is a good resource to have. There's two other resources here, and Kristen will be alluding to some of them. This is the Resilience Evaluation Analysis and Learning Award. This is a consortium that's dedicated to generating a lot of new knowledge, research, and guidance around resilience measurement. So just wanted to start people off with some some goodies that you can refer to later. Some quick housekeeping. We want this to be an interactive conversation as much as possible, so I encourage everyone to use the group chat. The presentations will be about 30 minutes, and we want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A. Given the number of participants, we're having everyone muted, so if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll be monitoring them throughout. We'll try and address quick clarifying questions in the chat box and save the more substantial ones for the Q&A, and I'll be compiling those and giving them to Kristen and Elliot. If you have any technical difficulties, we do have Ashton Britton on the line. So she is available. We'll also be sending a recording of this webinar out later today if you have to duck out early or if you have a colleague that you'd like to send this to. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. We have Elliot Levine, who is the Deputy Director of the Environment, Energy, and Climate Technical Unit, and Kristen Lambert, who is the Program Manager for Climate Change and Resilience. So we're lucky to have these unique perspectives on stress. Elliot has been instrumental in the development and evolution of the stress process from practically day one. And at this point probably talks about it in his sleep. He is so steeped in it. Then we also have Kristen, who is bringing a fresh perspective to stress and has recently conducted a review of some of the outcomes, successes, and challenges of the process. So I look forward to seeing both of those. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Elliot.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Or at least Brad, can you hear me? Since everyone else is muted.
Yep, I can hear you, Elliot.
All right, fantastic. All right, so if this all works, you should see my screen advance to the next slide here now. Well, great. Thank you, everyone, for the chance to talk about Mercy Corps' strategic resilience assessment process. It's great to have you all here, and it's also really nice to see so many familiar names in the chat box pop up, as well as a bunch of new names. So as Brad mentioned, I'm going to get us started by providing a bit of background into Mercy Corps' strategic resilience assessment process, which we call, for shorthand, we call stress. But before I do that, I'm just going to give us a little bit of background on where this is all coming from at Mercy Corps. So a few years ago, Mercy Corps started what we call our Resilience Initiative. And that really began as an acknowledgement of the fact that this perfect world depicted on this slide here doesn't really exist. That ideally, what we like to see is that over time, as development dollars are being invested, we would see an increase in well-being. And while certainly some achievements have been made to that effect, we've also noticed that there's a whole ton of risk out there. That what we're seeing is the well-being outcomes and achievements we've made are increasingly at risk to a range of sort of social, economic, and ecological disturbances. Everything from natural disasters like floods to reoccurring and more extreme droughts to mass migration or urbanization, all act as disturbances that we would likely want to build resilience to and reduce risk. So in reality, we recognize that this is much more of the world we live in, where we're able to achieve some increase in well-being outcomes, but then due to these different various disturbances, we're seeing a loss in them. And so for Mercy Corps, what this quickly meant for all of us was that good development, as we know it, simply wasn't good enough. Not taking into account risks in a more systemic way than we had done in the past wasn't simply just increasing risk to our programming. We also saw it as increasingly reckless with the budgets and the opportunity we had with we were working. So this led us on this journey of figuring out for Mercy Corps what resilience actually is. We started, like many, focusing on a definition. For us, we described resilience as the capacity of communities in complex socio-ecological systems to learn, cope, adapt, and transform in the face of shocks and stresses. This is probably not all that unique from definitions you all have seen. This is a definition for us that brought together the components of resilience that we were excited about as an organization in a way that we felt that was couched well in the values, ethics, and processes of the way that Mercy Corps works. But we quickly moved on from focusing on what resilience meant to Mercy Corps to a focus on how we were going to operationalize it. And this is something I do really want to point out about the way that Mercy Corps approaches resilience, in that it's not just a buzzword that we're putting at the front of our proposals or a new piece of terminology that doesn't really affect the way we work. When Mercy Corps describes a resilience building program or says we're taking a resilience approach, it means that there are certain key things about the way that we work that change. The way we design, the way we implement, and the way we monitor and evaluate our work changes as a result of taking that resilience approach. And we primarily do that through this resilience process that we've worked to develop over the course of this initiative so far. And I don't have enough time on this call today to go into each component of this. Clearly, we're going to focus today's call on this blue bubble here in the center that says stress process. But if you're quickly looking at it, a couple of the steps in here, like theories of change, adaptive management and measurement, evidence-based learning, even some sort of an assessment process at the beginning of a design process, might not look that distinct from other types of frameworks for the way institutions work. I would say that in this case, it's not so much what these steps are as much as it is the way that we're approaching them. And I just want to draw your attention to that big yellow bubble on the left-hand side. This is what we call our resilience lens. And it's made up of 5 resilience questions, of which I'm sure many of you are really familiar with at this point. Resilience of what, resilience for whom, resilience to what, resilience through what, and resilience to what end. We use these questions to frame up how we approach each step in this process. And that's really, for us, what brings that resilience approach. So today we're going to focus in on that blue bubble there in the center on stress. Stress is really the first step in our resilience process. But you might be asking yourself the question, and we get asked this often when we're talking about stress, is why we needed to develop an assessment process in the first place. Most often people point out that there's quite a number of good assessment processes already available. That's true. There are a lot of very great assessment processes that continue to be useful and valuable even within a resilience framework. We spent a year basically experimenting with different assessment processes for a whole host of different reasons, whether it was designing a country strategy or designing a program. And we came away with that year reinforced by the fact that we did in fact want to go and develop an assessment process. And we designed stress as the outcome of that realization around 4 key principles. And these 4 key principles, to me, illustrate some of the challenges that we had during that year of experimentation. So the first principle we designed stress around was that we wanted it to be sector neutral. The thing we know about resilience and have known from the very beginning is it's clearly not a sector-based issue. One of the challenges of, so any sort of resilient design or resilient strategies needed to go beyond any one sector. We need an assessment process that could do that. But in experimenting during that year, we at multiple times tried to combine different assessment types, be it a climate vulnerability assessment with a market systems assessment, or a gender assessment, or a disaster risk assessment. We had a whole host of problems, and they didn't really speak to each other all that well. mostly because they were all operating under their own sector-based frameworks. So it made it really challenging to combine that information. The second is we wanted stress to be multi-scale. This comes from the realization that many of the shocks and stresses that the communities that we're working with are dealing with happen, maybe they're experienced at their scale, at the household or individual, but the root causes or driving factors of those things can happen hundreds or even thousands of miles away. And we wanted an assessment process that was going to help understand that. The challenge that this sort of links back to and when we were designing stress, or what led us to design stress, is that each assessment process that we had experiment with operated at a different scale. Some of them were at the individual scale, like gender assessments, for example. Others at household scales, others at community, and then some even at national. And again, they had problems really speaking to each other as a result of that. The third is that we wanted stress to focus on learning and not just findings. We knew from the very beginning that slapping down a 50-page report at the end of an assessment process was not going to lead us to the outcome that we wanted. And that outcome is simply that we wanted teams to be able to design and implement resilience building programs. And that meant that just reading a report wasn't going to do the trick. Instead, we were going to need to work with our country teams and our program teams to really go through a process of learning what resilience means in context. So we wanted an assessment process that could do that. And then finally, we wanted stress to be structured, obviously, around a resilience framework. Again, one of the challenges of all these sector-based assessments is that they provide good information, but then it can be a challenge to reframe or pull that information together in a way that can really help you understand resilience. So we developed stress, but what is it? So stress, simply, it's a methodology and a process that helps teams apply resilience thinking into their unique humanitarian or development context. And what that means essentially is that it's a data collection and analysis process that's iterative and adaptive. And the outcome really is that teams understand what the gaps in resilience are in the places that they're working, and have the information needed to design strategies to increase resilience. We learn a host of different types of information from stress, but if we were to boil it down to 3 areas that pretty much all stress focus on, the first is that we learn a lot of information around the different social, ecological, and economic shocks and stresses. And teams are, hopefully, when they come out of a stress process, are able to prioritize what are the most impactful shocks and stresses. In particular, what are the most impactful on the systems necessary to support the development outcomes they're trying to achieve. We're also looking to get information in a stress process on who is impacted, and in what ways, and how are they impacted differently. This is what we call differentiated vulnerability. So trying to understand how women experience a shock or stress differently from men, how a young boy may experience different shocks and stresses differently from his father, for example, or how different livelihood groups, how like pastoralists, for example, will experience drought differently than a farmer. All really important for designing resilience capacities. And then finally, we're focused on gathering as much information about the abilities and resources that these groups need to better be able to prepare for, to manage, or recover from those shocks and stresses and impacts. So when we've now applied stress in a variety of different contexts, and we've come up with a set of rules that we kind of use to guide when we will go through one of these assessment processes and when we don't. And so we tend to use our stress process when we're developing a new country or subnational strategy. This is, in this particular case, this is not program specific. This would be a strategy that guides a portfolio of development investments for Mercy Corps, either at the country level or at a sub-country regional level. We also use them when designing large multi-year programs, specifically when resilience building is a goal of that program. And then finally, we use them as a framework for informing our inception phases of programs, or when we're designing this, or when we're beginning complex programs. Stress for everything. And we've gotten really good now at saying no when stress isn't really useful. particularly when developing just a general theory of change. It's not that useful. It should, the team going into the process should have some desire to actually incorporate resilience lens into the work they're doing. If not, we tend not to let stress be used, just because it is so resilience specific. We tend not to use them for community level action planning. So when we're working in a new community or trying to redesign our strategies within a community worked for a long time, if we're just working at that scale, stress is not necessarily the tool to be doing that scale of planning. We also don't use them for short-term projects or for answering specific research questions. So stress looks different in each place we do it, but overall, the stress process looks roughly like this. It starts off with some sort of a kickoff discussion. Mostly this discussion is framed around providing initial answers to those 5 key resilience questions. And in particular, one component of this that's really important is to understand with the team exactly what are their goals and objectives they're trying to achieve in the first place. What are the well-being outcomes the team is trying to achieve? And then what are the shocks and stresses that those teams are seeing impeding their ability to be able to do that? We then use those as a way of starting off a framing of what will be included in this stress process and what will be excluded. And this includes practical things also, just like what geography are we talking about? What types of livelihood groups and gender groups will be part of this assessment as well. This tends to lead to some level of background research, which then informs what we call a scoping workshop. That funny graphic there that looks kind of like a bubbly octopus, that's our unique way of showing the fact that we do systems mapping. And systems mapping really is just a visual exercise that we use to structure the entire 2 to 4 day scoping workshop with various team members internal to Mercy Corps, but a whole host of external stakeholders as well. And what we have them do through this systems mapping work is we have them break down social, economic, and ecological systems in the places that we're working. And then we use those big drawings, those big systems maps to introduce the subset of shocks and stresses the teams decided on in the kickoff discussion. And we can trace the pathways of those shocks and stresses through those systems maps. So here's one example of a very simplified small chunk of one of the systems maps that explored one of the key development trends in the area, which was declining pastoralism and livelihood incomes that are associated with it. I mean, so you can see there's a whole host here of different social, economic, and each ecological factors that are contributing to this decline in pastoralism. And you can see there's already some shocks and stresses like conflict and disease in here. Again, this is an incredibly simplified version of this that was just meant to be able to tell a story of some of the outcomes we learned about from one of our Uganda stress assessments. But at least gives you a good idea. In reality, and I'm sure as many of you have seen in systems mapping before, it's a much messier process. So we use the scoping workshop to really frame up our research agenda. And research within a stress process takes place over 3 primary areas. It starts with secondary research, primarily making sure that we're looking across all the different activities and assessments that have been produced not only by Mercy Corps, but by the range of other actors in the place we're working. We then use that to inform a series of expert interviews. This can be with sector experts, but this can also be with local stakeholders at sometimes at the community level or ward or county level, oftentimes also at the national government level. We try to link up with universities as well as our peer agencies as well. And here, expert interviews are really about going in more depth into a particular topic or trying to fill gaps in the secondary research. Data collection then ends with the community level work that we do. We place this at the end because it's often the most time consuming and the most expensive. And we want to ensure that we're using that opportunity with communities to our fullest benefit. And so we tend to structure any focus group type discussions that we're going to do around trying to get information on the impacts of shocks and stresses on them or gaps in resilience capacities that they have till the very end. Now that may look very familiar that may look very familiar, and I'll go into how we focus that on resilience in a minute. But I just want to note that we end this process with another workshop. So this is now the third. And so you can see talking and getting together pretty regularly to discuss findings and information is absolutely key to this process. But we have at the end, we do what we call a strategy workshop. And here we're taking all the information that we've gathered, and this is where we actually start to develop resilience capacities based on the information that we've been collecting, and then use those resilience capacities to design a theory of change. So like I was saying, all of that can look fairly general, fairly, not that specific to resilience, but we're able to keep a resilience focus throughout the stress process by really focusing on 4 key things. No matter what type of data we're collecting or type of data we're analyzing at any one time, we're always trying to do one of these 4 things. We're always trying to characterize development trends and constraints. We're trying to prioritize and characterize shocks and stresses to get at that resilience to what and resilience of what question. We're trying to understand differentiated vulnerability. As I mentioned before, how are people experiencing shocks and stresses in different ways? And then we're trying to identify, really importantly for a stress, we're trying to identify what are the resilience capacities that are needed, either to be established or enhanced through Mercy Corps programming and the programming of our peers. And so by always focusing the information that we're gathering through this framework, we really are able to keep that resilience focus. So at the end of a stress process, teams are able to, teams often end up with a product that looks kind of like this. They're able to have what we call a development vision, which at the top you'll see is a goal statement, followed underneath in green by some outcomes that help to achieve that goal, and then a set of objectives that help to achieve each of those outcomes. Importantly, though, they're then able to articulate how that development vision then is impeded by a range of these social, economic, and ecological shocks and stresses. This is just a simple version of the way we sometimes like to illustrate this in a way that's not a 10-page report, but that can be quickly sort of digested. And then even more importantly on top of that is that teams are able to articulate what are the different capacities that need to be included in their development vision in order to account for those shocks and stresses. And this is where it can get tricky, because talking about capacities at a high level can be really challenging. What we found is that early on in our stress processes, we'd write these reports and we would develop our information, and we would go to talk to people around what are the resilience capacities we're gonna build through our programming. And we'd say things like, we're going to help pastoralists and farmers get access to savings and loans. And they would say, that sounds just like some of the work you've been doing in the past. How is that different from the development work you have been doing and your focus on financial services? What we knew during those very early stresses was that we needed to help teams think through a way of describing and breaking down resilience capacities to better articulate what is different about them. And so one of the key tools that the team uses to do that in a stress process is they fill out what we call a resilience capacities framework. This is just a summary of what that resilience capacities framework actually looks like. And it's an Excel-based tool that helps teams to organize their different capacities by type and different types of information. But the goal here is to really help teams break down a capacity so they can articulate what's different about it. So a couple of the key things here is that, there's generally 1 or 2 lines describing the capacity in general. So this might say something like access to loans. We would articulate the exact specific set of shocks or stresses it's going to be used against. So this could be a drought or a flood. And again, we push teams through the stress process not to just talk about natural disasters or something general, but very specific shocks and stresses it will be used against. We ask teams to define the user. So this could be a group of people, an individual, institutions. These are the ones who will actually apply or use that capacity. We differentiate that then from the provider. who are the individuals, processes, or systems appropriate to provide that capacity. And then we talk about the effect. This is like a little mini theory of change of its own. And here in the effect, what we're trying to do is get teams to articulate exactly what the outcome of using that capacity in the face of a shock or stress will be. So to continue with our loan example, if livestock owners and farmers take out loans to invest in risk reduction products or risk reduction technologies, for example, financial losses will be minimized or avoided in the face of a drought. And in that statement alone, we can begin to already define how we're thinking around a typical development strategy, something like getting access to financial services such as loans, which can have very important well-being outcomes. But we're also then able to articulate what the resilience benefits are as well. And then finally, we want teams to be able to articulate what are the links to those development outcomes or objectives in their development vision that we were looking at earlier, so that we understand that relationship. So I'm going to stop in just a moment, but I want to mention I want to take a step back in the stress process now that we've gone through step by step a bit of the process and kind of dug into the data and what some of the outputs look like. I also wanted to share just some higher level outcomes in two places. The first is Uganda. In Uganda, we've done a couple of stress assessments, both at the sub-national regional level. And the first one we did it was, one of the places we did it was in Karamoja. So there it was to help the team develop a new strategy for Karamoja. But the team had another purpose in doing that, which was to develop a regional platform of a whole host of international and national development actors working in Karamoja. And they use the stress findings to do something that I think is really inspiring, which is they use the stress findings to develop a common vision amongst all the other peer NGOs and the donors in the region to unite them around a common path forward in terms of achieving development goals and objectives and building resilience. This is really important because the team there recognized, as I think Mercy Corps does in general, that it's impossible for Mercy Corps to build resilience on our own. We don't have all the skills needed to be able to do this work just on our own, and that we're going to need to work with a whole host of partners in order to achieve those outcomes. And then the last example I just want to provide before handing it over to Kristen is to talk about the work in Niger. In Niger, we employed a stress to develop a new country strategy. And this assessment took place roughly over 5 months, if I'm remembering correctly. And one of the more interesting things to come out of this was the change in scale that the team started to work at. And I mentioned scale being an important issue earlier, and I think this gives a good example of it. One of the key issues, obviously, we looked at in Niger is water scarcity and drought issues, and the implications for that in the growing agricultural economy there. The team had been working on water scarcity issues mostly at the community and on-farm level, looking at on-farm sort of water management and water point access. But by going through stress, they started to realize that their ability to address this issue needed to be complemented with work at the national level. And in order to do that, we were going to need new partners. So as a result, Mercy Corps established a partnership with NASA to be able to monitor groundwater and started to work now with the national government to build the capacity of those agencies who are responsible for managing land and water to be able to better monitor and manage groundwater. To me, this is an awesome example of where assessment findings can help to inform the work that we do in a different way and really lead us into new and very different strategies from what we were doing before. And it's exactly that kind of type of outcome we'd love to see from our stress process. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand it over to Kristen.
Okay. Thanks so much, Elliot. I'm going to talk now about some of the key lessons coming out of our ongoing review of the strategic resilience assessment, the stress. and some of the ways we've been improving and adapting in response to what we're learning. So why are we reviewing the stress now? First of all, we now have about 10 stresses that are complete or are in progress. Each was conducted in a different context, had different objectives and outputs. And this gives us a really rich body of evidence for us to improve our approach. We have been doing reflections so far, but mostly informal, internal, and right after the stresses wrap up. But now we have the real award, the Resilience Evaluation, Analysis, and Learning Award with the USAID Center for Resilience. And this is giving us the opportunity to do a bit more. So it's with their support, we've been able to follow up on stresses after some time has passed, to dig a bit deeper and more intentionally, and to extract findings across the countries. So we kicked off this review process about 6 months ago using a qualitative approach. It's mostly structured interviews from the leadership level to advisors and a range of stress participants. And the goal of all this is so that these case studies can give us a clearer sense of what are the things that have facilitated successful stresses? What are the things that have hindered them? Where do we need to focus to improve the process? But we're also generating more general learnings that really are relevant as well for others conducting any kind of resilience assessment. So next month, you'll be seeing the first set of case studies coming out, and I'll share the links at the end of our presentation. And these will focus on 3 stresses: in Niger, in Uganda, which you heard Elliot talk about, and in Nepal. Here, I'm just going to highlight 4 of our key findings that have bubbled to the top and talk about how we've been taking some steps to address those. First finding that came out loud and clear across these stresses is that people really appreciate the learning aspect of stress. We heard from members across all levels who talked about how the stress is unique because it creates the space for teams to pause, to step back, and to strategize. And otherwise, this isn't really built into our programming. It's an opportunity to critically engage as a team across sectors and even bring in external stakeholders in this shared learning experience. So this isn't a one-way training, it's more of a discovery process. It's iterative and investigative. And throughout our reflections, what we heard from people is that a couple of the tools and aspects of the stress really clicked with them. People talked about the systems mapping exercise that Elliot talked about that's helped people to see what systems thinking looks like in their own context and to draw those new connections. They also talked about developing a theory of change, putting shocks and stresses on top, and thinking about the capacities. And this just illustrates that resilience is really a different way of working. We also heard a lot about the value of a staff-led process, that the national team is the one leading the data collection, they're the ones in the field doing the report. And all of these things have really benefited capacity building, but we've also found in this review that we've missed some opportunities for learning. By not being as explicit as we could about what our learning goals are and holding ourselves accountable to it. It's clear that, simply going through the stress process isn't sufficient for equipping people to be able to then act on the findings. And I think this really points again to how stress is different from a typical assessment, which might result in your typical data findings and point to key leverage points. Stress instead is not just about what we're working on, but it's how we're working. It's a new resilience mindset. And that means there needs to be something different in how we're supporting people to learn during this process and equip them to carry out the findings afterwards. So to do that, we've had to be better about being explicit about our goals and objectives, holding ourselves accountable to that, being more targeted to what specific staff need to be able to do after the stress to implement the findings, apply resilience concepts, and building key reflection points for measuring progress. Since the beginning of stress, this has also required improvements to our facilitation approach and the tools that we use to support learning. And that's something we're continuing to work on. One thing that we heard again and again is that resilience is really complex. And stress is a complicated process, and it stretches over months. And as facilitators, we have to make sure that participants aren't losing sight of the whole. Where are we in this journey? Where are we going? How is this piece that I'm working on contributing to that outcome? So we need to make sure we're reiterating the goals, everyone's aware of the true north, and that people know that they're on the right learning path to get where they want to head. So since the early stresses, we've developed some better tools for getting there. Our workshops have improved, but we still have some way to go. The other finding that emerged and is related to this is really the critical role of communications. We're hearing that a communications plan is really a critical piece to making sure the stress process leads to concrete results that meets the needs of our program teams and our country teams. So I think, as anyone on this call probably knows, resilience can be really hard to communicate. The crux of the concept is often the details, and we found that sometimes our stress products have not really hit the mark in clearly communicating what the stress does and why it matters. So this can lead people to feel uncertain about what it all added up to. They can disengage with the process, and they might miss opportunities to mobilize other partners. So there's a few steps that we're taking here to improve our communications approach based on what we've seen has worked in other contexts. So first, we're now integrating a clear communications plan from the first stage. Being really clear about what are the external goals the team is seeking, who's the audience that they want to reach, and how do we package that information so that those people can take hold of it and use it. So Elliot mentioned Karamoja, for example. The team knew what it wanted to get out of its influence goals. They wanted to reach regional partners and get them on board with a shared vision so that we can work together to build resilience in the region. And that gave direction and helped to ensure that the products were a bit more useful that came out of this to fit that goal. We're also experimenting with different ways of packaging results. A 50-page report is not really going to be the right product for every person. We need to see what clicks with different audiences and thinking outside of that standard report format. So this means slide decks, videos, posters, and different kinds of messaging for different audiences. And coupled with this, we've also found that we need to increase our investment in storytelling. That's a way that really communicates resilience so that's digestible and more tangible to people. And it provides an opportunity as well for the communities that we're working with to share their own experiences with what a shock and a stress means for their own lives, how resilience capacities can help them better respond, and what the process kind of means to them and looks like on the ground. The third finding that came out was about translating the findings from stress to ongoing work. And we're seeing that this really requires an intentional process and invested guidance for doing so. So we know stress has been productive. We know we've had a lot of successes, and we're continuing to see more demand for it across Mercy Corps. So something's working. And yet we've also seen that there are challenges often in translating the stress findings to implementation. And there's a few things happening there. One, this is something Elliot also alluded to, but by the nature of its findings, the stress points to new scales and sectors of intervention. It requires new ways of working, and teams aren't always equipped to pick those up right away. We've also seen there are particular challenges in conducting stresses at an inception phase. There's boundaries on the kinds of work that those teams can do, and it can be frustrating to then conduct a stress that's pointing you outside of your constraints, and you can feel frustrated that you're not able to incorporate that within the program. There can also be a mismatch with the granularity of our findings. So at a country strategy, you need broad strokes. What are the key stresses? What are the regional or national level trends? And here we've been pretty successful about getting people what they need to formulate those strategies. But at a program scale, if you're looking to translate those immediately into your work plan, you need something different. These generalizable findings aren't going to get teams to where they want to go. So we found in some cases, for example, the stress ends, it's informed a strategy, but staff aren't sure how they put it into practice. And of course, we also see the time constraints. when the stress ends and the leadership team and everyone else feels like they need to respond back to putting out fires in a complex context. So what we're doing now, we recognize this is a challenge, and we're trying to be much more intentional about the needed outputs of the stress early on. You know, in 3 to 4 months, where do you want to be? What do you need to get there? Where does the stress contribute to that? And this helps to sync expectations, objectives, and the work plan, and also make sure that the scale and the level of details are appropriate to get people where they want to go. We're also increasing our support to program and country teams to develop plans that have explicit next steps to take this forward. And we're increasingly focused on tools rather than just products, so teams are equipped to work differently after the stress. And the final thing that's really bubbled to the top through this review is that implementing the results of stress really requires us to look beyond our technical approaches. We have to also consider the enabling environment. And this might mean our operational and administrative processes and the partners around us. It's important that we don't think of stress as the solution to everything. Resilience findings touches on multiple aspects of a project. So there are things that we need to do differently beyond just our technical work. Stress findings can challenge the way that we recruit, the way that we train and equip staff, and the way we have to partner. So in the recruitment process, for example, stress hones in on a set of programming things we want to do differently. But we're also trying to breed a different culture and a different way of thinking that supports resilience programming, considering external risks and adaptive management. And we found without breeding this culture, it can be easy for people to slip back into traditional development. So amongst other things, I think we have to look at our HR approaches. We might need to hire differently, look for managers who are curious and can adaptively manage. And this is particularly true at the leadership level, having the champions that can carry forward the resilience findings. We also have to look inward at the ongoing training and support that can make sure that we're cultivating the capacities within our team and providing the ongoing support to reinforce this through regular resilience training. So Mercy Corps is in the process of developing a more robust and advanced resilience curriculum across our agency, and we think that'll help to provide a more supportive structure. And we also have to look at our external partners. Implementing the findings of resilience assessment is not going to lie with one agency. We know that there's multiple sectors, that people have expertise in other areas, and that we need these to be sustainable. So in the Niger stress, for example, it revealed the need for us to shift our water management approach from single-site boreholes to a larger national landscape scale to address the problems of groundwater. And through this, we've had to develop new partnerships. We're engaging with NASA for their satellite data and analytical skills, and also pulling in the governance partners to make sure that structure is in place to take up and provide the supportive policy necessary for a new groundwater approach. So just to quickly recap, the 4 things that we've highlighted in this stress review is committing to the learning journey and holding ourselves accountable to that through more tailored learning plans and measuring progress. Emphasizing a larger role for internal and external communications throughout the stress, including a larger emphasis on storytelling. We're getting better at anticipating, planning, and preparing to support the translation from resilience results into action, and looking beyond just our technical approaches to the supporting environment that'll allow us to implement resilience findings. So I'm just gonna stop there and remind you all of a couple websites where you can find more about our work on resilience and under the REAL Award. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. And right now, so I've been collecting the questions in the chat box. If anyone else has any other questions, please do feel free to add them in the short amount of time we have left. So first question is, the effect is a theory or assumption. How do you confirm it's not just an assumption but a fact? Is it based on documented evidence? The next question is, I'm curious as to how the analysis of shocks and stresses, the process differs or is similar to HEA, and if you all have used HEA outcome analysis as one input. Then the next one is, why do why does Mercy Corps limit the use of stress to large projects, new strategy, etc.? Aren't at least some of the concepts applicable and important to all activities? What are the implications of being resilience blind in any development work that is done? Okay, we'll start with those three, and then we'll come up with any additional ones. Elliot, do you want to take the first one? And I think you're on mute still.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So I'm assuming I'm off mute now. So that first question is, can you restate the first one for me?
Yeah, so the effect is a theory or assumption. How do you confirm it is not just an assumption, but a fact? Is it based on documented evidence? And I think this is referring to the effect of the capacity.
Right. No, it's a good question. It's one we get quite often, actually. So, I mean, the thing to recognize is that the stress findings are a theory. We put together what we call a theory of change, which articulates a set of capacities that we believe will build resilience. The only way to truly understand or truly know if the capacities that we're implementing actually build resilience is to test them in the face of some sort of shock or stress. And so we often talk about our stress process as the beginning of our engagement in resilience in one particular place. We may find that we might shift course on implementing certain resilience capacities because they're not having the effect that we'd intend them to have. That's perfectly fine with us, as long as we're continuing to learn from that and moving away from capacities that don't have the resilience outcomes that we'd like them to have, and sort of scaling and strengthening the ones that do. So in short, yeah, they are theories, and the only way for us to really learn if they do build resilience is through actually implementing them and programming them, and then using our research and learning team to be able to test those for us.
Great. And the next one is actually for you as well. Can you talk quickly about any kind of differences between the HEA and the household economy approach?
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, I'll do my best. It's been a little while actually since I looked into an HEA, but I was asked this question a few years ago as we were developing stress actually. So, and this might be wrong, and I recognize that HEA also may have evolved, and that there's probably differences in the ones I've seen. I'm sure there's variations in these assessments as well, just like there is from stress to stress. So the way I understand the HEA is that it really focuses on looking at income and food access. And in particular, it looking at the impact that different shocks and stresses can have on sort of baseline income and baseline sort of food access. Stress would be interested in those types of things, but I think stress goes beyond just looking at the impact on income or food access. Stress is focused on the influence or effect of shocks or stresses on other types of outcomes, such as governance-related issues, such as conflict, and sort of strengthened market systems. So in that sense, it's a little bit broader than just looking at sort of income and food access as its primary issues. It also looks, and I'm not sure if HEA does this, but it also looks at the relationship between shocks and stresses and spends a lot of time trying to understand how they drive one another. So in particular, looking at how a shock like a drought might fuel resource-based conflict, and then the unintended outcomes or consequences of that. And a lot of times that leads us to things with, decreases in income and food access, but that's largely not sort of the sole set of impacts or things we're looking at within a stress.
Great, thank you, Elliot. Kristen, we'll get to you in 1 second. There's one more for Elliot. I think he'd be well placed to answer. And this is, why does Mercy Corps limit the use of stress to large projects or new strategy? Aren't there at least some concepts applicable and important to all activities? What are the implications of being resilience blind in any development work that is done?
Oh yeah, also a really good question. So we don't limit the findings from being applied to to those smaller programs. I realize that what I said earlier during my presentation could be a little bit confusing. So stress is a process that takes a significant amount of resources and time. Like Kristen, I think, did even better job describing than I did. It's a learning journey that we take teams on. And so that means teams have to spend a good amount of time with us going through a process, getting involved in data collection and analysis, taking away sometimes from the work they're doing. So we're very careful about when is the right time to invest the staff time and the amount of resources and money required to do that. The larger programs that we have, either as they're starting up during an inception phase or when we're pre-positioning for an opportunity we know is coming down the line, tend to be those best opportunities given those resource investments. But a lot of the findings we're able to do through a big sort of DFAP type, an assessment that's meant to inform a big DFAP program or one that's meant to inform a country strategy, we can use those findings to inform a host of the smaller programs that we would never do stress individually for. I think it's important to recognize that at Mercy Corps, at least, the country strategy level ones, those guide a portfolio of programs. So if we do one at the country strategy level, it provides information for a whole host of different programs, ones that could be adapted that we currently have going on, but also ones that might be coming down the line, which will be able to utilize the stress processes. So it's not our intention that our smaller programs be resilience blind. I like that terminology. We tend to avoid that if all possible, and we more focus on how we take those stress findings, and as Kristen was talking about, how do we then apply those to our programs? And that definitely applies to those smaller programs as well as the big ones.
Great, thank you, Elliot. So the next question here, I'm gonna answer part of, and then I'm gonna hand off the rest to Kristen. So the question is, do we do additional analysis of secondary data, e.g. annual or biannual panel data collected by governments that may bring out vulnerabilities? And so I'm gonna answer the first part of the question, where as much as possible, we try in the stress process, as Elliot had mentioned, as we try and leverage secondary data as much as possible. Recently, we had an opportunity in Nigeria, and I'll ask Kristen to talk more about the stress that we're doing there. We had the opportunity to leverage exactly this data, this panel data, that we were not only able to, we were able to reanalyze. So often we're just limited to taking in the data and taking what is given in the report. We actually had an opportunity to use the data set and reanalyze it and to answer questions that we were interested in to inform this Nigeria stress. And I think it's also, Kristen, can you talk a little bit about like what we're doing new or differently in the Nigeria context with the stress that we're doing there?
Yeah, sure. Hold on, we're having some audio issues.
There you go. That's better.
Sure. Thanks for bringing that up. I think the stress that we currently have underway right now has been a bit exciting for us because it's our first that we're doing in a fragile context. So we're in Northeast Nigeria. Our colleague, Sarah Henley-Shepherd, is supporting that work. And we're learning how to apply resilience to a whole new set of challenges, including working with individuals in IDP camps to learn what are the resilience capacities within this different context that can help to build resilience. So this is underway. I think we'll have some really interesting stuff out in a couple months, especially since we've been applying as well some of the learnings from this review. They've been very intentional about adaptive management, tracking learning throughout the process, and better integrating feedback and storytelling throughout it as we go. So I think this is just an innovative way for us to find a new application for the stress.
Thanks, Kristen. That's great. So we're coming up on time here. Do we have time for one more question, Kristen and Elliot?
Sure.
It's going to be a doozy. All right. So, and Nicola, I did see that your question about the documentation on the Uganda stress. We do have documentation on that. I shared Elliot's email in the chat box, so you can reach out to him directly on that. So we can follow up on that offline. The last question is really a difficult one, and I may ask Ava to clarify a little bit in the chat box, But Ava asks, Elliot talked about applying resilience thinking and resilience lens, and Kristen talked about resilience mindset. Do you have any reflection about mind shifts versus building resilience as a property in a system? What do we need for development today? That's in 1 minute or less. What do we need for development today?
Hey, Kristen, do you want to go first on that question?
You look ready, Elliot.
Yeah. So the question was, just to make sure I'm seeing this right, talked about applying resilience thinking and resilience lens, and Kristen talked about resilience mindset. Do you have any reflections about mind shifts versus building resilience as a property in a system? Yeah, that is a doozy of a question. One of the things we're looking at trying to do with them, I mean, for our teams, this sort of shift in thinking is, I think, one of the primary reasons we designed the stress process in the first place. It's one of the primary reasons we've designed it, and it's honestly, when going back and looking at some of the outcomes that we've seen as part of our stress processes, and some of the work that Kristen described kind of touches on this. When we look at what teams appreciate about it, it's that shift in sort of thinking, bringing a resilience lens to the way they think, that has been useful. So there was a quote, I think it was from our Niger team, that talked about, some of the follow-up work they've done. I'm not sure if Kristen mentioned this quote now, I don't remember. But what it essentially said was, and this might have been the country director at the time mentioning it, saying, once the stress stopped, the team continued to basically ask a similar set of questions around those 5 resilience questions as they were doing their work. So as they're thinking about follow-on strategies and programs, they continue to ask those same questions. What are the shocks and stresses we're going to see that are going to be impacted? How does our programming need to respond accordingly to that? And what we know is that since the stress has ended, they've actually had follow-up workshops to look at their theories of change, to evaluate their resilience capacities and say, are these still the ones we should be working with? So in some ways, that applying resilience thinking and a resilience lens, that's what we're talking about here. In that way, the outcomes of stress have gone on beyond the stress process itself, and the team is now actively utilizing a resilience framework in the way they think. At least for me, that is like probably a much better outcome than a shiny document or shiny report that we could publish and put out.
Great. Kristen, did you have anything to add to that? And you're muted.
No, I think that's really a great recap, Elliot. And I think that rings true from what we've been finding in these reviews, that through the shift in thinking, people are able to identify new cross-sectoral intervention points, cross-systems, and that's also showing up in new program design, that we're hearing that that the teams, especially the ones that took these lead steps were part of the core stress team, and really had this resilience thinking ingrained in them, are able to also see how to design new programs that are responsive to the resilience needs in different contexts, and think about the nuances, the differential vulnerabilities, and apply these to new work. And I think that's really, really emblematic of the learning experience of this process.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Elliot and Kristen, for sharing with us today. Incredibly informative. I encourage anyone participating, if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Do check out some of those resources that we shared on the slides. And once again, I'd like to thank the RML community of practice for putting this webinar together. And look forward to continuing the conversation offline. Thank you, everyone.